you want energy in your life, get you a rap star. I got me one.
All I wanna be is a rap star when I grow up. Bust shows on BET when I blow up. Fans from miles away, they gon' show up. POC is what the crowd gon' go up.
Right here on the Saxahontas Show with me, the queen of crazy, goddess of sexy, and the first lady of cool. Yes, I'm crazy, sexy, cool, baby, just in case you didn't know. So sit back, relax, and get ready for an extra, far from ordinary, quite legendary, ahead of secondary, this very revolutionary show. And as always, stand firm in peace, solidarity, and with purpose.
Probably heard of Jack Daniel, but you may not know of a man named Nathan Green, or Uncle Nearest, as he was called in Lynchburg, Tennessee. Nearest was born into slavery in the early 1820s. Once a free man, he became the first African-American master distiller when he went to work for his friend, Jack Daniel. And until recently, most people didn't know he was responsible for teaching Jack Daniel how to make Tennessee whiskey. Fawn Weaver, founder of the Nearest Green Foundation, uncovered the long-forgotten story and is now sharing his history, not only as Jack Daniel's first master distiller, but also the man that helped launch an American icon. There is even a new whiskey honoring the legacy. This one's not made by Jack Daniels, but it is a Tennessee original, just like Nearest.
anything. And he was just not interested. And every day I would bring it up interested. And finally I said, it's my 40th birthday. I want to go to Lynchburg. He's like, I'm planning Paris. We can go there by way of Lynchburg. So we go, and I wanted to interview the descendant of Nearest that was in the New York Times. So I pick up the phone and I call him. Very easy to Google him. He's 93 now, so he didn't realize the Yellow Pages was now all online. I knew his address, I knew his telephone number, I knew his cousins. And I call him and I said, you know, Mr. Edie, I'm Fawn Weaver. I'm an author. My husband's an executive vice president for Sony Pictures. We think there might be a book in this. We think there might be a movie in this. Do you mind if I come down and interview you? And he says, well, I'm 92 years old and I can't tell you where I'll be in 2 weeks if I'll still be alive. But if I'm still alive, you can come and interview me. And 2 weeks later, I showed up at his door and I knocked on the door and he had this surprised look on his face, and I thought, well, maybe I should call first. He is 92 years old. His wife later told me he was expecting an old white lady. So apparently I sound like an old white lady over the telephone. But we sat down and we began to talk, and as we were talking about the story which he knew nothing about. He didn't even know how he was related to Nearest. All he knew is that his mother told him he was somehow related, and he heard what Nearest had done. He heard that he was this distiller, but he didn't know anything more than that. So the longer I talked to him, the more I realized, well, I'm not going to get any new information here. So I began asking about life in Lynchburg. I began asking about, what's your experience? Again, the name is Lynchburg. And he's, at the time, 92 years old. And he starts describing this wonderful city. And he's talking about these different families and talking about what life was like and what they went through. And the longer he talked, the more I realized he wasn't distinguishing between black families and white families. He was talking about them because they all lived side by side, they worked side by side. There was an equality among them, which I couldn't quite wrap my head around because it was called, I hate to say it, Lynchburg. And so I'm sitting and I'm talking, and his wife, who was a 4th grade teacher for 40 years. So she went through integration, she went through that whole process. And I remember Board versus Brown of Education and just kind of what that looked like. And I remember seeing the National Guard on, like, I remember all of these different things. And so I said to her, what was integration like for you? And almost without even thinking, she says it was a non-issue. You guys saw the pictures of the National Guard with Brown versus Board of Education, right? And in a city called Lynchburg, it was a non-issue. And I said, well, how could it have been a non-issue? She said, well, the kids were actually excited they were going to go to school together because they were already playing with each other before school and after school and on the weekends. So they were just happy they were now going to be able to go to school together. I said, so let me get this straight. They were playing together in the 40s and 50s and 60s. Do I have to? She's like, yeah. So what would they do? Oh, they would play in the creeks. They would go and they'd run around and they would, I said, so at the same time that Dorothy Dandridge put her toe in a pool in Las Vegas, they drained the pool. You're telling me that the kids of Lynchburg, black and white, were playing together? It was that moment that I knew this story had to be written. It was at that moment that I knew this story was actually bigger than Nearest. So I began contacting all of Nearest's descendants, and I brought together in a church all of the African American elders of Lynchburg. There were about 50 of them that all came, and I asked them to tell their stories, and I figured maybe they had a different experience from everyone else. If you bring all a bunch of African American elders together in the same room, there's nothing that prevents them from telling the truth. I mean, they're so old at this point, they don't have to lie. Like, they are fully free. They can say whatever they want. And story after story after story was life here was beautiful. Life here was amazing. But as I was a distiller. But they didn't know anything more than that. But they knew all of his family. So one by one, I began interviewing the family, and they're like, we can't prove it, but this is what we understand to be. We can't prove it, but this is what we think it is. We can't prove it, and I realized that if we were going to tell this story, we had to be able to prove it. So I put together a team of about 20 archaeologists, archivists, genealogists, and throughout the country, pulled documents from 6 different states. I interviewed over 100 people. And this is what I know to be true. Nearest Green was born in Maryland, sometime around the 1820s. We find him in Lynchburg around the 1850s. Have no idea where he was in between. And that seems hard to believe, but if you think about it this way, until 1865, African Americans were not citizens, we were property. So it is almost like trying to track cattle from Maryland to Tennessee. It's impossible. There's no records. And so we see him in Lynchburg at the middle of the 1850s, and he's working on a farm for a distiller and a preacher who doesn't have any records of owning slaves. So it's more likely than not he was renting Nearest, because Nearest was already a very skilled distiller. If you've ever seen like these ads from Andrew Jackson when he was looking for his runaway slave, and he put ads all throughout Tennessee, and it said, I'm looking for my runaway slave. He is my best slave. He's my distiller. See, the distillers, there was a price for them that was very high. So for a lot of people, they just rented them. I have no idea who Nearest slave owner is. That I don't know. I know his last name, Green, matches the last name of the largest slave owner in the area at the time, Townsend P. Green, and Nearest's grandson is named Townsend Green. And it is the history of slaves as we would name our children and our grandchildren after the slave owner, because we only knew so many names. So that was pretty common. So I'm pretty sure I know the slave owner, but I can't tell you for certain. What I can tell you is he was on the farm, and he was the man who ran that distillery. The white preacher and distiller, he had to make a choice. And I heard as a historian, Nelson Eddy was doing a thing on Bourbon Daily yesterday, and he was telling us this story. And he said the preacher had to decide which spiritual he had to decide which spiritual calling he was going to stick with. His congregation and his wife were both saying, get out of the distilling business. And he chose to get out of the distilling business. Sort of. It was still on his property, but the property was 313 acres, so he could be in his home and not have to worry about the distillery, because the distillery was fine all by itself, because Nearest was the boss. And he had workers for him putting out the best whiskey there was in the area. And somewhere around in the mid-1850s, definitely before the mid-1860s, there is a young white boy that comes to live on the farm as a chore boy. He lost his mother at the age of 4 months. He was the 10th child. So it was not an easy upbringing for him. He had to figure out pretty early on how to fend for himself. So he began to work at this local farm, and he began to work for this preacher and his wife. And he'd go fetch water from the well, he'd milk the cows, he'd run after the pigs, he did everything that a chore boy would do. This little boy's life was not privileged in the least. And he would always see the smoke coming up through the holler down on the other side and say, hey, what's going on over there? Now, what I do know is he already knew what was going on over there, because his father had a little moonshine going on his own property. And so he'd always ask about that. And over time, he proved himself to be as young and as little as he was to be a great worker. So finally, the preacher and distiller said, listen, I will show you what's over there. If you want to know how to do what we're doing over there, I'll show you that. So he takes him over there, and he introduces him to his book says, a coal black Negro. And he says, this is Uncle Nearest. He's the best whiskey maker I know of. And the preacher asked Uncle Nearest to teach the young boy how to make whiskey his way, which was what we now know to be Tennessee whiskey. And as the years go by, this young boy becomes this amazing entrepreneur and businessman, and he'll take the whiskey and he'd go out and he'd sell it to the soldiers. And as he got a little older, he would take the whiskey and he'd take it out and sell it in the general stores and sell it in all the different stores. And he became, as little as he was, he never grew to over 5'2". As little as he was, he overcame all of that because he was just this brilliant business mind. And he knew what he wanted, which was for his name to go around the world. After the Civil War, he began his own distillery on that same property, which if anyone has done it or read any interviews that I've done, we own that 313-acre property where Nearest taught the young boy and where the preacher and the distiller were. And the original distillery was there. And he put his name on it, and he put his name on the jugs. And as time went on, he went and he purchased a distillery location that had better water flow and all the rest of this good stuff down the street. And Nearest decided to retire. He decided not to go to the new distillery, but Nearest's children, 3 of his boys, Louis, George, and Ott, Louis, George, and Eli, all went to the distillery. Then George's children, Charlie and Ott, would later join them. And they continued to help the young man to build this business. And over time, his name would travel around the world, and he would be known as the most famous whiskey maker in the world. You, of course, know him to be Jack Daniel. And the young African-American slave, not young, old, his mentor, his teacher, his first master distiller, his story would be lost in time. Until now. So thank you, because I believe with every bone in my body that there are 3 people in heaven who have been playing puppet tricks with this story. My niece who passed away, which is truly, it's a part that I skipped in this story because it's still a very difficult thing for me. She was like a daughter to me. And she passed away right after I read the original story. And the true reason why I dug into this and why I found myself in Lynchburg is because I didn't want to grieve. And the easiest way not to grieve was to find something to dive into. So I dove into this story, but I believe the reason why she had me on this story is because I think she got to heaven and she saw one little white man and one really tall black man. And she saw them sitting next to each other and walked over there because they were welcoming and they were friendly and really, quite frankly, it's an odd sight. And I believe with everything that is in me that my niece went over to them and they're talking about this story that has never really truly been told, that's never truly been given the honor and the distinction that it really is worthy of having. And I believe that she said to them, have you met my Auntie Fawn? She will tell this story, she will tell it with honor, she will tell it with love, she will tell it with respect. And she will make sure that the world knows who Nearest Green was, but she will make sure that it is told in such a way where she builds the legacy of Nearest without harming the legacy of Jack. And every single one of you in here, I want to thank you, because when you leave here today, you will continue to build the legacy of Nearest without harming the legacy of Jack. Thank you.
Oh, I gotta convince you?
touchdown.
Wait a minute. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Here we go. Take a look at me, baby. Am I everything that you need? Cause looking at you, I can see you're everything that I want. A sweet lady.